Coming to you from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. My guest today is David L. Ulin. He's a book critic for the Los Angeles Times and the author of many books himself, including, let's start from The Myth of Solid Ground, about earthquake predictions, The Lost Art of Reading, about the lost art of reading, a novella called Labyrinth. He is also the editor of books you will certainly have seen if you're into Los Angeles literature, Reading Los Angeles and Another City. He also did one of those 33 1/3 books on the Clash's London Calling, I believe, which I haven't read yet myself, but I found out about it earlier today, and now I want to pick it up. Tell me, before we talk about this new book, London Calling, why is it important to you? We're in Los Angeles, let's talk London for 1 second.
No, we will talk London Calling. Actually, it's interesting, that was a book that I ended up I wrote part of it and then never ended up finishing.
Wait, so I can't get it?
You can't get it, although interestingly enough, it is in the tradition of many ghost books. It is reviewed, I believe, on Goodreads.
Really? Okay.
So I always find those kind of things. There's a great story about Jim Crace, the British novelist who, because of a computer error, a book of his that never existed was offered for sale on Amazon, Amazon UK, and Crace himself decided as a kind of prank to see how high he could get the Amazon numbers, since he knew he would never have to pay for the books he was ordering because there was no such book. He eventually got it up to number 84. So I kind of love the idea of these ghost books. What I will say about London Calling is that it was the record. Well, that was the band, but it was the record that really kind of blew my head off musically when I was 18, 19 years old. I was coming from much more of a sort of hippie jam band tradition, which I still adhere to in some way. And I sort of got punk as a concept, but I didn't get it as a visceral force. And The Clash and London Calling in particular really changed that and allowed me to kind of see punk as part of a continuum rather than less a break, although somewhat, but as part of a continuum, because if you listen to that record, everything is in there. I mean, they're going back and referencing Stagger Lee, and they're playing all kinds of American styles of R&B, covering old Mose Allison songs, and as well as sort of what we would consider to be more straight-ahead punk music. So it opened up my sense of it, and I'd never heard anything like it. I kind of admired both its ambition, which I still do, its sense of kind of taking ownership of something, and also its looseness. There's a real sense of play to that record.
It took away the sense of punk exceptionalism.
In a way, yes. I think that's right. I mean, they weren't Johnny Rotten saying, this is year one. And I mean, I've always have been kind of ambivalent, partly drawn to sort of the extremism of year one revolutionaries, and also aware of the fact that, there is no such thing as year one. And anytime we better be careful about the people who are declaring it's year one, because they are, I believe that's Joseph Stalin was a year one thinker.
Yeah, you want to distance yourself from him. But listeners, David's new book is not this book on this ghost book, which may or may not ever see the light of day.
I don't think at this point, there's still a sort of little fantasy, but I kind of like the idea of it existing as a ghost book.
I like it too, but I was looking forward to ordering it after this, so now I'm a little bit disappointed, but I'm not disappointed in his new book, which is Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles. It is about this city that we sit in right now. Originally it was named for the district we're sitting in right now, yes, Miracle Mile?
Yeah, the original working title was Miracle Mile. And when I was finished, my editor and I had a long conversation about whether that worked as a title, whether it was something that would translate outside of Los Angeles in a certain way. I mean, a lot of the book revolves around this neighborhood, or sort of Mid-Wilshire, Mid-City, Miracle Mile, this kind of collection of neighborhoods. And ultimately, we just sort of decided, we had a long conversation where we sort of started investigating other possibilities without ruling that title out. And somewhere in there, we came up with Sidewalking, and we kind of fell in love with that.
So would you say Los Angeles, like punk music, there's kind of a myth around, or an idea that this was going to be a new type of city that destroyed the old models? This was a sort of year one city. I mean, would you say that kind of exceptionalism is something you've also shed by exposure to the city over 25 odd years?
It's interesting. I would say there's certainly an air of Los Angeles exceptionalism, or a kind of sense of Los Angeles exceptionalism. Exactly as you say, this was going to be a new kind of city, going back to the beginning. It was a city as an American city. I think there are all these different distinctions that are worth thinking about. I mean, if we're really talking about Los Angeles as an American city, which is essentially a creation of the late 19th, early 20th century, it was a different kind of American city because it was going to be, the come on was to middle class Anglos from other parts of the country, right? Once the railroads were completed, the first real estate boom in the 1880s, part of the draw in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, as it's interesting how nothing ever changes, right? How the big cities, particularly of the East Coast, were basically welcoming in immigrants from Europe, Eastern European immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian, etc. There was a nativist strand among those cities who felt, that they were being overrun, and part of how Los Angeles was built or developed was by saying to these sort of middle-class Anglos, come here, we'll build a city that doesn't have any of these issues. Of course, that's not possible, and it completely belied the fact that they had built this city on top of what had once been part of Mexico and was essentially occupied territory.
You're never in year one.
You're never in year one. But that idea of building a year one city, I think, is one of the things that one of the central kind of conflicts or questions about Los Angeles. We see it now in terms of not just in Los Angeles, but in the Southwest in the United States. But we see it in terms of all of this sort of ridiculous uproar about immigration, which just never kind of goes away. We're all immigrants, right? I mean, there's a great line by Gary Snyder that says, if you're talking about place in the way that, people like to talk about place, deep roots, generational, it's like nobody has a sense of place in California. It's just not possible, except for, the Native Americans who were here 1,000 years ago, or the Mexican Americans who were here when it was Mexico. So we're all immigrants in our way. And I think that tension is really interesting. This doesn't really answer your question, but it is a kind of an interesting set of tensions, and it does belie that year one, that exceptionalism. I mean, Los Angeles, like every place, is specific and has its own specific set of questions and problems and charms and history, and it's also generic in a way that, all American cities, let's say, probably all cities, but all American cities face a certain kind of shared set of challenges and developed in a certain way. We talk about sprawl in Los Angeles, which is certainly part of its culture and its history, but it's certainly not by any means the only American city that sprawled or suburbanized with the advent of highways and freeways in the years after World War II.
The line I was going to quote was one from a piece you anthologized in Reading Los Angeles, one of my favorite pieces of writing about Los Angeles, I think one of yours as well, which is James M. Cain's Paradise from 1933. He said, trust an immigrant who got here in 1930 to haze an immigrant who got here in 1931. I mean, the same phenomenon applies here, it seems like, but that essay, I feel like it starts, for me at least, a tradition of writing about Los Angeles. The tone of it, or the scope of it, even though it's just an essay, it does feel very large in scope, covering a place that's very large in scope even then. But writing a book like Sidewalking, were you thinking at all of being in any kind of tradition of Los Angeles descriptive writing?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I never would think consciously of being in a tradition because I think that would be overwhelming in some way. I'm definitely aware, particularly in terms of writing about Los Angeles, of being part of an ongoing conversation. I think that one of the reasons that I end up writing about or using a lot of writerly sources in the book, quote from a lot of writings, is I want those voices in the book. I want to have the book feel like a conversation that I'm having with those voices, and hopefully have it be open so it's a conversation that the reader is having with those voices, and we're all having a conversation about the city together. I think part of that has to do with the fact that Los Angeles does have a history, obviously, and it does have a set of traditions or a way of thinking or a kind of conversation that exists about the city. That's always been a kind of cornerstone, or not always, but it's certainly been a cornerstone of a lot of the work I've done in terms of writing and editing about the city over the last couple of decades, and I'm very aware of wanting to be part of that conversation. So I don't know. I mean, I do position myself, I would say, in some ways, if there was a tradition that I was positioning myself in, it would probably be a tradition that maybe begins with Cain, or maybe Louis Adamich around the same time, slightly before Cain, Carrie McWilliams, Mike Davis, Norman Klein, the kind of contrarians, the love-haters in a way. And I think that it's because it is a complicated place, and stirs complicated reactions. What I also makes those writers different, Didion fits into that category too, I think, is that they are either natives or long-term residents. They're here for the long haul. I mean, one of the other things about that essay, Paradise, which is an essay I adore, is that Kane says, yeah, there are a lot of problems, but I'm here, I'm not going to leave before the show is over. It's got all this, there's also all this promise. I mean, he uses Paradise, both as a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing, but also in a way authentically. And he is writing about it from the inside. One of my favorite parts of that essay is that long opening riff where he basically imagines Southern California as a watercolor map, and he talks about it's not green, it's not green, it's kind of dusty, and he sort of, undercuts a lot of the physical myths of the place in 2 or 3 pages while extending this metaphor, while actually describing the landscape pretty accurately as to what it is. I think Kane was trying to write about what was actually there. Doesn't always succeed, but I think that was his intention. And in that way, I think he kind of sets up that conversation or that other tension. Are we going to talk about the real place, or are we going to talk about the myths? And what does it mean that they're both kind of interwoven at this point, so it's impossible to talk about one without talking about the other?
Now, I've read a lot of Los Angeles books, not as many as you have, admittedly, but I've read as many as I can. And yours is the first book that I've read that captures this current phase of Los Angeles. This is not what I would call it, but people are going to say your book captures Los Angeles becoming a real city. Again, I wouldn't say that myself, but your laughter tells me that you realize this will be said as well. Does the term real city have any meaning to you?
No, I actually, one of the people I talked to in the course of, the book sort of developed over a long period of time, but one of the people who I talked to is a guy who was a professor at USC who's now in Nevada, but a guy named Greg Heiss, who's a really smart urban...
Magnetic Los Angeles guy.
Yes, a really smart urban theorist. And at one point when I was talking to him, we were talking about, I said something about organic cities, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, he said, there is no such thing as an organic city. Cities do not grow out of the earth. They are not by their nature. All cities are artificial. So in that sense, there is no such thing as a real city, or all cities are real in their fakeness in a certain way. But I do see the point. For me, it's an interesting moment, because I think a few things are happening. One is you could say, and I think that I think you could actually say fairly accurately, it is LA becoming in its own particular Los Angeles way a kind of more traditional city, in the sense that we think of traditional cities. And again, that's a trope that we invent, but it's becoming more like an Eastern city. It's becoming more verticalized, it's becoming denser, it's becoming more self-conscious about its cityness in a certain sense. It's developing a collective identity, which it probably always had in some way, but it feels more it feels like there's a more pronounced sense of, let's say, pride of place, or kind of Los Angeles identity, that feels like it's not just Culver City or Santa Monica or Echo Park or Studio City or Angelino Heights, but that there's something that they kind of share, like a sense that we're in it together. I think that is partly has to do with the redevelopment of downtown and the idea that there's actually some kind of center to the uncentered city. I think, I'd like to think it has to do with light rail and public transportation, although I think the jury's still out on that, but ridership numbers are up. I'm very eager to see what happens once the Expo line opens to Santa Monica, and then once the Purple line extends out, so it begins to access more neighborhoods. I think there's also a sense that it's a real, we have all known it's a real place, but it's a real place in the sense that often it's difficult and unnavigable, and we're kind of in it together that way too. And I think that the sense of things that, I've been arguing for years, that it's a vibrant, exciting, intellectual landscape, social landscape, artistic landscape, all of these kind of things. All that stuff is exploding in various ways now. So we're aware of it as a city in some sense. I also think, though, that in a lot of ways, it's I think I used the phrase in the book, Back to the Future. It's not so much a new Los Angeles, although it is, or let's call it an evolving Los Angeles. I do think of it as an evolutionary process, but it's also a kind of return in some way to a World War II Los Angeles. The idea of streetcars, we had this fabulous streetcar system until it was just torn out. So the idea of streetcars and light rail and that kind of public transportation, the idea of a city that is somehow centered around downtown in some way, with a vibrant downtown, the idea of a city of neighborhoods, which Los Angeles has always been. In many ways, I think the freeways are another neighborhood in their own way, but all of those things were part of the fabric of the city before the kind of suburbanization and the real sort of institutionalization of the sprawl. It feels to me that sprawl Los Angeles, the freeway, suburban house, never get out of your car, streets are not framed as public space Los Angeles, that worked pretty well for about half a century. It doesn't work anymore in the same way. There's just too many people here, too much terminal gridlock, and too much desire, I think, to commingle, right, to get out on the street and to sort of engage. And so I think that quality of engagement, maybe that's what I'm talking about rather than pride of place. There feels like a real sense of engagement with the city, like direct engagement with the city, which I think is both new in terms of the Los Angeles of post-war Los Angeles, but also a throwback in many ways to sort of the Los Angeles of 100 years ago.
Right. I started living here in 2011, not that long ago, but I go to a lot of different cities and write about them, and Los Angeles has never to me felt like a different species than the other cities that I go to. Not hugely, but then when I'm here, the way that people who've been here longer than me talk about it, like they say things that seem either like myths or old ideas about the city or just lies, as if they were descriptions of the city. Like they'll say, this is an unplanned city, or you can't breathe here, you need a car. I haven't got one yet myself, and I don't feel the pressing need for that, or to do any. I don't feel the pressing need to do any of the things you were supposed to do in Los Angeles 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I wonder, is there a sense, I get the sense a lot that people often get stuck psychologically in the Los Angeles they arrived in. I've had a lot of conversations with people who, this is just generalizing out of many different ones, but let's say a guy got here in 1978 and he's telling me his argument why downtown will never become an urban center, and I feel like, man, it happened a few years ago. It's done. It's already done. But they don't see it. It's a mythical trope, and I hate to bring it out, but the idea of the Native Americans not seeing Columbus's ships because they didn't know what a ship was. I feel like a lot of Angelenos don't see what happened around them. Maybe I don't know why. Do you get that sense though?
I think that's true. I think it's probably true of a lot of things. I also think in some ways we look for or see the city that we want, or the city that
they complain about it. Do they want that?
But we want. I think you're talking to someone who grew up in New York, so actually complaining about the place you live is that's what you need to do, right?
If you don't do it, then it's a problem.
Exactly. That's part of that dynamic, right, or part of that vibrancy. But I think for me, in some ways, part of my excitement about the current state of Los Angeles, or the changes or the developmental process that Los Angeles is going through, is that it's growing into the kind of city I always wanted it to be. I hate driving, spend days at a time without getting in a car, although I have a car, and use it certainly. I love public transportation. I am delighted that that the city is not about to, but in the next several years we'll put a subway station in my neighborhood where I can walk to the subway and, possibly never have to get in a car again. And I like the idea of an urban core. I like the idea of a vibrant downtown. It speaks to me. Now, that may be because I grew up in Manhattan and that's a kind of urban model I'm used to. But it's an exciting urban model, and I don't think that it is antithetical to Los Angeles. I think, one of the great things about any major city, any huge city, but this one in particular, and partly one that has such geographic spread, is that you can have all of it in some way. If you want to live the kind of classic Southern California, live by the beach, you can do that. You want to live in a high-rise apartment downtown, you can do that. You want to live in a 1920s bungalow in a residential, you can do all of those things. And I think that is the promise of the place in some way. But yes, I think it's possible people get stuck in whatever their transformative moment is,
Right.
It doesn't only have to do with geography. It can also be aesthetics or, whatever, all sorts of things.
There's the Jerry Seinfeld line that every man dresses in the styles of the last good year of their lives. This might be the same phenomenon.
Well, that's scary because I dress I've dressed the same way since I was 12, so I don't know what that...
You had a good age 12 year, good adolescence. But you mentioned soon you're going to have a subway station in your neighborhood, which is a good thing. It seems like to me it's unequivocally a good thing. But you have this story in Sidewalking about how you went to a neighborhood meeting. I don't know if you mentioned the era, but you were talking about how cool it would be at the meeting to have a subway station there. And someone there says, you're not saying you want a subway station in the neighborhood, right? What was going on in that person's head? Because I can say right now I have no idea what they were thinking when they just were almost rhetorically being like, well, obviously this guy can't want that.
Right. Well, actually, and the response I said was, I want a subway station on my corner.
And doesn't everyone is my idea.
But this was in 1991 or 2. I had just moved here. It was the only neighborhood planning meeting I ever went to. I'm not even sure why I went, but I did. I knew it was about the subway. I was excited about the subway coming in. They were talking specifically about the Red Line, which at that point was about, within a year of the first leg of it opening up, the first 5 stops from Union Station to, I guess, MacArthur Park. And there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of NIMBY resistance. There was a lot of NIMBY resistance at that time in the early 90s to discussion. I mean, the discussions of putting a light rail on the Exposition Boulevard right away was already happening then, because that right of way was perfect. It was there. It had to be cleaned up, but it was already laid out, and there was an enormous, particularly the further west you got, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of running trains through neighborhoods, and I think it was just coming out of that. I think it was a sense. I also think there was a sense on a lot of people's part that they did not want Los Angeles to be like New York.
In what sense?
In terms of, well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for them. My cynical and judgmental response was always that it was all code for crime, and that there was a way that if somehow public transportation would allow the other to bridge the borders of neighborhoods, and that was a dangerous thing.
Buses went there already, presumably.
Well, and so do streets and freeways. It's not like it's that difficult to get around the city or to get into whatever neighborhood anyone wants to get into anyway.
As we know in Los Angeles, no criminal can drive a car.
Right, exactly. But I feel like I feel like in some ways I've always felt that a lot of kind of community resistant to infrastructure projects has been is coded in that way. I think that does speak to, in some sense, Los Angeles among its sort of bleaker aspects is it has a long institutionalized history of segregation, housing covenants, neighborhood dividing lines, etc., and of suspicion of the other. And I also think that in many ways, how do I want to say this? I think that, the kind of private house model, right, which, Adamich discusses but derides in a certain way. He calls Los Angeles the enormous village, which is reminiscent of Richard Meltzer's line that it's the biggest hick town in all the hick land, one of the great, great lines ever written about L.A. But he talks about it as a kind of, it is an enormous small town in the sense that its social life is built on a single family house model. It's very domestic in nature. That can be great in many ways, but it can also be difficult because it does resist the idea of the commons or public space. I think that was only exacerbated as in terms of what we were just talking about in the post-war freeway era, where you could easily go from home to work to wherever you wanted to go and back to home without actually being in public space, or being unadulteratedly in public space, right? Without some kind of buffer around you. And so I think there's a lot of, I think there has been a lot of suspicion in that sense. And so change, particularly change that sort of in some way draws the city together, can be something to resist. Happily or otherwise, that is changing. I mean, we saw that even with the idea of putting the subway, the Red Line, or I guess the Purple Line in Beverly Hills. There was an enormous amount of resistance claiming to deal with geologic concerns, but it was really, I think, about other concerns. So I think these are part of the challenges, and I think that is sort of a legacy of a kind of suburbanized culture, which this city has institutionalized as part of its urban culture.
It's one of those, it's my standard, not a rant, but a standard point I make, that people blame the cars for everything in Los Angeles. Oh, the car culture, oh, this driving, and how far you have to drive, and the commutes and the freeways. I feel like it is a bit misplaced in terms of the actual source of the problem. Like, sure, there are cars, but only because people feel an obligation to have them because of the house culture. I wouldn't say there's a car culture here. Look at the roads. These are all bland vehicles, and the people driving them just feel obligated to. No one's excited about their car. Right. But the house culture has made this happen, right?
I think there's that. I think the spread of it, too. I think it's and I think also the fact that, literally once the red cars or, once the streetcar, the red cars were pulled out, or in the, it's impossible to get around this landscape by bus. So public transportation as an option becomes really an option for people who are either too young to drive or can't afford to drive. And then it becomes a class issue. And that I think it certainly has become, and hopefully is becoming less so with light rail and subway, but it has become a class issue. Then all these other things come into play. But initially, I think it had to do with mobility, right? Once you have to take a bus for an hour and a half to get from Santa Monica to downtown, or from Pasadena to downtown, or wherever, then, it's not worth it. Even now, living sort of in this neighborhood, I would take public transportation when I was working downtown as much as I could. But if I didn't catch the buses right to get to the subway, it could take me 2 or 3 times as long to get downtown as it would if I was driving. So that's a problem, right? Public transportation has to be efficient above all else.
It's true. And you mentioned the stretch from Santa Monica to downtown, and I think of a line you quote in Sidewalking from a piece of writing I admire about Los Angeles, but don't quite understand, from Carolyn C's Golden Days, where it's this image, it's a vivid image, and people refer to it every now and again in various texts about downtown being the thick coiled root and the stem of the 10 freeway extending west, and this is obviously not verbatim, but it branches out of that stem, growing into communities you might want to live if it goes right, for you.
Right. If
yes.
You're lucky, or right, yeah.
But to me, I like the vividness of the image, but I guess the downtown is the route I get, but why choose one particular freeway and that one to be the lifeline that is what Los Angeles is reduced to? Because of course she starts saying, they say Los Angeles is big, but they lie. It's just this. But I can't think of a reason why that's what Los Angeles would just be. You can live along the 10 or literally anywhere else, to my mind.
No, I agree. I think what she's saying, I actually wrote about this passage. That passage has always been quite resonant to me because, as I said in the book, it gave me a Manhattanized model. When I first moved here, I read that book fairly early, I think in the first 5 or 6 months I was living here. And it gave me a Manhattanized model, which was the urban model I understood, and a way to begin to frame the city, or take what felt to me like a very chaotic urban landscape and give it some kind of order, even if it was a false order or an imposed order. And I think in some ways it was, and I think in some ways it wasn't. And I think in that sense, you could make that argument that there is a kind of central corridor of Los Angeles, or let's call it a Manhattan of Los Angeles, although as I give that image, I disavow that image. But, that you could say downtown, the 10 to Santa Monica is about 10 miles long. Downtown is sort of the financial district, the Battery, the residential districts, and then the end of it. So there's a way that it creates a narrative. I think it creates a narrative. I think it is a striking image. I think it's certainly not even close to being all of Los Angeles. I also think in some ways she's writing about how people think of Los Angeles, and so in some ways I think that's an attractive lens, particularly for a readership that may either just live in those communities or may not live in Los Angeles at all and is looking at a way to frame it. So, like most of those images or metaphors, I think it's a useful one, but I don't think it's a complete one.
So could she have written the 101 or the 110 or indeed Wilshire Boulevard, and it had been the same effect for you? It had to narrow it down to one line.
It had to narrow it down for one line. In some ways that was a line I recognized because I was sort of living in the middle, and I would spend time there. I had not yet begun to explore, say, the Valley or the South Bay. I'd certainly not begun to see anything that was east of downtown, San Gabriel Valley, or any of that stuff. That was all pretty alien, and I was looking for a kind of a frame that I could understand, and that actually also I was physically familiar with, that I was in. As I became more familiar with the rest of the city, that seems like less of a defining metaphor for me. But I think it's the search to define the city that is the most interesting. I also think that because Carolyn lives in Topanga Canyon, and sort of that is in a way she's tracing her own stem, right? Her own stem to the city. And I think that that's the other thing that sort of offered me, was that it is personal, right? That the city, like all cities, is defined by our engagement with the city, our interaction with the city. So my experience of the city is my experience, her experience is hers, yours is yours. The landmark places that we identify are landmarks to us for various reasons, whether they be just familiarity, that's where we happen to be, or some kind of personal affinity or something along those lines. So that idea of kind of creating a narrative of the city that spoke to your own experience of it was really, really important and useful to me.
Right, and I mean, I'll admit, you say she lives in Topanga. I've never set foot in any neighborhood ending in Canyon here yet, and I probably never will. I'll admit that. So, there's a sense in which they don't overlap, but a sense in which also part of me is like, why do I have to consider all that the city as well? Do I really have to? Do you feel an obligation to consider Los Angeles sort of the greatest, the widest spanning definition of Los Angeles? Do you feel an obligation to include everything?
I go back and forth. I mean, I certainly consider anything that is city of LA. So in the most mundane sense, any street corner I'm on that has a blue street sign, not like a light blue, but that LA blue street sign, that's LA, right? Just by political entity, if nothing else. I kind of love the idea of Topanga being part of the city in the same way that downtown is part of the city, in the same way that Boyle Heights is part of the city, in the same way that San Pedro is part of the city. That all of these things kind of add up to this bigger whole. I define it all sorts of ways and at many different times. I mean, it's there's city of LA, there's county of LA, there's all the unincorporated stuff. There's the, what do we want to call it, the Southern California megalopolis, right? You could make the case, as Mike Davis does, and I think quite well, that it's Santa Barbara to Tijuana, Pacific Ocean to the Inland Empire, right? That in terms of the kind of the sort of the footprint of Los Angeles as metaphor, psychological footprint, that it could be that. And I think that's a valid argument to make, and certainly an argument that I've made. You could also say that Los Angeles is, is whatever it is, right? It could, whatever you want it to be. I think that's actually, for me, one of the great challenges and satisfactions of thinking about it and writing it, is that it defies those definitions, or it's all of them at the same time. And I have to figure out a way to balance those distinct and sometimes opposing visions of it in my imagination, because it can be all of those things.
Right, and you mentioned Mike Davis's vast definition of Los Angeles, and this is something I see pop up a lot in the history of Los Angeles writing, 60s, 70s, 80s. On the earlier end of that spectrum, there's a book I like a lot, one of the more forgotten Los Angeles descriptive books, The Ultimate City by Christopher Rand, and he does a similar thing where he says, you might as well he talks about the various geographical entities that could be Los Angeles, and he says, you could just consider everything south of Santa Barbara and north of San Diego Los Angeles. And it's like, why though? Why is that cool? Why is that impressive? Why would you want to do that? What is the advantage of considering an unfathomable slice of land to be Los Angeles?
Oh no, I agree. And I think actually, I don't spend a vast amount of time in San Diego, but enough. I have some good friends who live there, and it's not Los Angeles. I mean, it's similar to Los Angeles in the sense that it's another big Southern California city, but it's definitely not Los Angeles any more than Santa Barbara is Los Angeles, any more than Riverside is Los Angeles, or San Bernardino is Los Angeles, or frankly, Pasadena in a lot of ways. I mean, Pasadena is interesting because it really, it's part of greater Los Angeles, but it really is a city with its own identity that is very distinct in many ways from Los Angeles. But I think in some ways I think it's all about looking for definition. And so for me, at least, the longer I've lived here and the longer I've thought about the place and the more I've traveled through or spent time in various corners of it and thought about how it fits together, the more I think about it as this kind of collection of distinct communities or distinct neighborhoods. Yes, that adds up to a larger whole, but there are those distinctions, and I want to sort of see those neighborhoods, those communities, for what they are. I think there is, if we buy the sprawl model as the only model, then, what is sprawl? What's the best sprawl, the biggest sprawl, right? So in that sense, it's the best metaphor for sprawl is the biggest, but it fails. I mean, I think even Davis, in the prologue of City of Quartz, when he writes about those housing developments out in the Antelope Valley that are being platted before they've even been built, he posits that the city will just continue to expand. Well, that was 25 years ago. At that time, which is about a year before I moved here, or so let's even say in the early 90s as I was living here and getting to know it, I absolutely thought he was dead on correct. That was exactly what was going to happen. I also thought that Blade Runner was going to be the future. But neither of those things happened.
I'm sort of still waiting on Blade Runner. I hope it's going to be.
It's 4 years away. I mean,
we might get there. Where are the geishas on the side of that tower?
But we need replicants, though. There are no replicants. But anyway.
We don't know that.
We don't know that. That's true. Maybe they are human replicants. But in any event, we know from sort of the history of the San Gabriel Valley, and we know the history of the Antelope Valley. We know that, from the foreclosures, and we know from the difficulty of that commute, and, all those things, that it didn't work, that Los Angeles, one of those myths that has completely exploded was the myth of endless expansion. Los Angeles hit its limits, whatever those limits were, whether they were actual physical limits like the mountains and the ocean, or just distance limits. And then it kind of, I don't want to say it contracted, but it sort of has folded back in on itself in a certain sense. And in that sense too, I think that may be something psychological or psychologically relevant about the change in the way we think about the city. It no longer feels, for a whole host of reasons, to be the city of limitless possibility. And I think that's actually a good thing.
Now, talking a little bit more, your colleague at the Times, Christopher Hawthorne, who writes about architecture, he did this series Reading Los Angeles a few years ago, just I think before I came here, where he wrote about books like City of Quartz. And
Banham. You wrote a great piece about Banham, about Los Angeles architecture for colleges.
Him as well. He's folded into this question too. Ben, why not? Christopher Hawthorne wrote that the City of Quartz, we remember certain parts of it. We remember it selectively, and parts of it have not aged well.
Right.
And I reread the book recently. I can tell you I was turning a lot of pages without fully reading them toward the end. But there are some very relevant sections that are still extremely relevant. Rainer Banham is a better writer than Mike Davis. So that's my opinion. On a sentence level. So whenever I read that book, For Ecologies, I read the whole thing. I don't skip anything, but I still notice the same phenomenon where the relevant parts are more relevant than ever, and the irrelevant parts are completely irrelevant. The same goes with Paradise, the James M. Cain essay.
That's right.
What's going on?
Well, I mean, I think, there's a few things. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think City of Quartz, parts of it really, really hold up. The parts that don't hold up really, really don't hold up. I think the same is true of For Ecologies. I mean, I sort of revere both of those books in many ways. City of Quartz was the book. There were a number of books I read right before I moved here to kind of give me a sense of what was going on. City of Quartz was far and away the most important and most influential and remains that way.
What did it tell you?
From the point of view of someone who hadn't been living in Los Angeles at that point, it's sort of, I mean, I've always been drawn to Davis's apocalyptic sensibility. I like apocalypse. I like apocalyptics. I think, but the idea that Los Angeles was somehow not this fluff factory, but was in fact, dark and dystopian and, built on inequities and, that it was going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. That coming from Manhattan, that really appealed to me in the sense that I was aware of that always in New York, and I was very resistant to kind of the myth of Los Angeles, the sense that it was the city that worked. It was a city that didn't have those kind of historical contradictions or that historical baggage. So I really liked that aspect of it, and I think he was right in many ways. I mean, I do think that book, I don't, obviously not intentionally, it wasn't witchcraft, but I think that book did predict in many ways what happened, not the riots per se, the Rodney King riots per se, but what happened after the verdict, and then what happened all throughout the 90s in terms of Los Angeles, partly because Davis had a strong sense of what the economy of the city was, and he wasn't reading tea leaves, he was seeing what was happening in its moment and kind of making a projection of how he thought things were going to develop. I mean, Banham, I think also in the sense of kind of actually being the first person who looks at Los Angeles in 1971, he publishes that book, but who looks at the city on its terms as opposed to his terms. He comes in and kind of takes it on faith for what it is. I think, the stuff that's far and away the most dated stuff in the Banham book is all the stuff about driving and the freedom that the car offers, which we now know is not true. But I do think in 1971 the promise of it was absolutely there, particularly for an architectural historian from England who had come in. And I think the other thing that's interesting about it is that he defines, there's that great passage where he talks about, I think I mentioned this the other night, where he talks about, as he starts watching the way people behave when they're coming off the freeway and re-entering the city, and they pull down the mirror and they fix their hair or they do whatever. And, the sense of the social landscape, or even thinking about the freeway as a social landscape, he's absolutely right. But that's a kind of a revolutionary idea, to take something that we don't tend to think about critically at all and think about it critically. That's one aspect of it. But to take something that is so maligned and so sort of derided and stereotyped, right? And, is fascinating. And to look at it as a kind of piece of the social fabric is just an act of genius. So I think the question as to why those books are still remain prescient in some ways and also date in some ways, just has to do with the kind of dynamic nature of the city, or of anything really. I mean, we have this sense that books somehow should exist out of time or be timeless, but in fact that's not possible. They have to exist in time. I'm always reminded of the argument David Foster Wallace had with his writing teacher. He called him the Great Gray Eminence. Yes. The story. So, the teacher would say, you shouldn't put in product. You don't put Coca-Cola in your stories. Don't put things that will date the stories, contemporary references which will date the stories. And Wallace, being the smartass that he was, said, but your stories, like, people talk on the phone or they use electricity. So how is that not the same thing?
The continents have taken their current form.
Exactly. So all of that stuff is true, and I think it's really the case. I mean, I think that we write out of our moment. We write in many ways about our moment, even if we're extrapolating into the future. Even if we're writing science fiction, for instance. I mean, we were just talking about Blade Runner. The closer we get to 2019, which was the year that Blade Runner takes place, the more Blade Runner looks like a movie about 1982, which was the year that it was made, which is as it should be, right? It grew out of that moment. And, so I think in that sense, like all kind of prognosticators or projectors or whatever, you only have the information you have at your disposal. And
you're going to extrapolate from that no matter where it goes.
You're going to extrapolate from that no matter where it goes. And what appears to be, but history is weird and things happen. There's a lot of randomness and chaos. And so, even the most sort of thoughtful or intelligent prognostication runs at least an equal chance of not coming true.
I would say that Banham is maybe the most talked about describer of Los Angeles still. And I wonder, there's this part. You mentioned his writing about the freeways. There's something he says there, and it's echoed throughout the book, that people don't really discuss this aspect of his perspective, but I think about it all the time myself, which is that he talks about the freeways and says that, this is the best motorway system I've ever encountered. And then he follows that up immediately with, but Angelenos, being who they are, they can and probably will just scrap this and build something new, closer to the perfection they're always seeking. Right. And he had a sense like, you think the architecture's bad? They're going to just tear it down and put something new up. They're going to just iterate. The city is like a metabolism. He didn't use the word metabolism, but that's how he seemed to see it. And I feel like not only have commentators on Los Angeles forgot about that about him, Los Angeles has forgot it to some extent, that there's this sense of that we're not stuck with anything really. We can build something better. And in the sense of, there's, as you say, there's more transit being built sort of as another layer on top of the city, but I think of the preservation movement, which has done a lot of good things, but they pick strange hills to die on. I feel like there's some mid-century coffee shops are not necessarily better than anything humanity could build in the future,
I don't disagree. But I'm also not a utopianist in the sense that, I don't necessarily agree with Banham on that score, only because I think one of the things that happens probably in all cities is that things solidify, right? The city solidifies. And so, the limitless possibility of kind of 1950s, 1960s Los Angeles, let's say for argument's sake, which was probably a lot less unlimited than we think of it looking back, had to do with the fact that it wasn't fully built up. As it gets more fully built up, things are already here. So, if you look at an older city, like New York, Rome, Paris. I mean, in some of the really old cities like Rome, there are structures that are thousands of years old that are still being used or have been adapted in some way. And what's really interesting to me is more how we adapt to the things rather than rebuild them. I kind of like the idea. I mean, I agree with you about the coffee shops, but I kind of like the idea that we are trying to kind of work with what we have rather than tear everything down and rebuild it. Although we do live in a landscape where nature will certainly tear many things down for us whether we wanted to or not. But I kind of like that, and I wonder if that's again part of the evolution of a city. I mean, I think I also think in terms of kind of time frames and lifespans. And if we think about it again, Los Angeles as a kind of contemporary American city is a very young city. It is very much it's maybe 125, 135 years, really. We're talking about it as a kind of American metropolis or American city. Really a creation, not a creation, but for all intents and purposes, a creation of the 20th century. And so, I tend to think about it in comparison. When I think about it in comparison to other cities, I try and think about it in comparison to other cities at a similar point of evolution, right? A similar point in their developmental history. New York, after 125 years, I'm not even talking about from Peter Stuyvesant days, but let's say New York, 125 years after independence. We're talking the turn of the last century. It's a very, very different city in terms of both its makeup, a lot of the kind of the immigrant culture, the ethnic cultures that we now define New York by are just coming or just taking root and are not part of the mainstream of the city at all at that point. So in terms of how cities develop and evolve, they develop and evolve over time. And I think part of that has to do with kind of working with the stock as opposed to constantly replacing the stock.
You have a longer direct experience with Los Angeles than I do. So, tell me if I'm too off base in thinking, though, that it does seem Los Angeles seems a bit beset now by a sense that whatever new thing we build won't be as good as what was old. Not in the sense of that it won't be historical. There's that element too, but in the sense of it won't be as inspired. It's going to be blender. It's going to be not the Los Angeles we thought Los Angeles was. Not everybody thinks this way, and I don't think it's crippling the city, but I get the sense that if something gets torn down, especially something people recognized or that was mildly iconic, there's a sense that we're just not going to do better. It's not going to be something distinctive. It's not going to be something special. It's not going to be anything we want.
It's an interesting point. I haven't really thought about that in terms of Los Angeles particularly. I think that's definitely the contemporary American malaise.
Sure. Los Angeles' problems are often just America's, right?
Yeah. No, as anywhere. And I definitely think that is our sense. And I think you can see it. I always think about the sort of disruption of infrastructure, or not the disruption, but the decay of infrastructure, right? If you think about one of the great challenges of the freeway system at the moment is that so much of it is in such disrepair. Right. And there seems to be certainly no money and no will to get the money to be able to do anything about that. So I think there is a kind of malaise in that sense. I think, we as a culture, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, think that are sort of wrestling with this fear or belief that our best years are behind us.
Right, and there's the sense as well, like you mentioned the freeways getting into disrepair, and there's examples from the U.S., a few, but around the world, a lot of cities, you can point to freeways or sections of freeways that have been torn down and made into something more appealing than a freeway. Not hard to do, but it's been done in many places outside Los Angeles. Bring that up here, see just idle conversation, you say, I wonder which is going to be the first freeway to go away, and it's like you said something that is not fathomable enough to even speculate upon, and is this another case of Los Angeles exceptionalism? Like, this is going to be the first place that no freeway ever goes down.
I don't know. It's interesting. There are plenty of freeways that were planned and never built. I think that in many ways the freeways, I don't have an answer to that question except to say that I think in many ways the freeways are so iconic on so many levels. whether, certainly as infrastructure projects, certainly as metaphor, certainly in terms of this kind of faith in mobility, whether or not that's an active faith or a viable faith at this point.
To me, they're like sculptures, because I never use them, and some are cool.
Right. No, they're very sculptural. I mean, right, Banham says the greatest work of man is he's completely wrong, but he says,
I think he said, to be fair, one of the great works of man. Even that could be
wrong. That's true, but it's not one of the great, whatever. But, he talks about the sweep of the 10405 interchange, yes, which, whatever, I mean, I don't know, maybe aesthetically, but, when you're sitting there trying to get on the road, it is definitely not among the greater works of man. But I do like that idea. I mean, I do, again, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the city and the freeways illustrate it is that it is a very utilitarian city in many ways, and that a lot of its monuments are utilitarian. I mean, for a long time it really puzzled me that there are all those memorial, this is the Clarence Wayne Dean, he's the motorcycle cop who died in the Antelope Valley during the earthquake, the Clarence Wayne Dean interchange, or, I was like, this is so bizarre, this is the monument that we build. We build we name a a stretch of freeway for somebody, but actually it makes an immense amount of sense, because that is, we use, what better place to put a monument than a place where people are, in some way. But I think there is this sense of the utilitarian, of like infrastructure is beauty, or the idea of kind of the creative requirement of infrastructure, the engineering creativity, the design creativity that goes into building that interchange, may well make it one of the greater works of man. And I think, for me at least, Banham was the writer or the thinker, the observer, who opened my mind up to that concept. I don't think I'd ever really thought about it in quite that way until I encountered Banham.
I mean, it makes sense what you say about the monumental or the memorial interchanges, put them where people are, but I think of another infrastructural, I don't want to say feature, and I don't even want to say infrastructural of Los Angeles, but those signs at just intersections of two roads. You'll see the blue signs that call it like Ira Yellen Square, yes, or An Chang-ho Square. They call it a square. It's just a traffic light. It's just an intersection. And I just sit there and think, Los Angeles, this is why you get made fun of. You call it, this isn't a square. Like, what? You've seen these things. I mean, What is your reaction to these?
I think they're largely ridiculous, but I mean, I think there's also that sense of, right, I mean, they're not, I mean, but I don't know, you can't really call it the Ira Yellen intersection. I guess you could. That would kind of be interesting.
Or build something that's worth being a memorial. That's
there's
one
that,
thing.
Yeah. Although, but I do think there's that sense of, I mean, this is also a place with its ludicrous aspects, which right, are also part of its, it took me a long time to realize this, but are part of its charm.
Right. It can be, it's true. And you mentioned the utilitarian nature of Los Angeles. I was just yesterday taking some students on tour of the Bonaventure Hotel, a building that it's hard to say, I wouldn't say I love it, but I am extremely fascinated by it and go in it regularly. And I've written and made videos about it and whatnot, so I guess there's a kind of love there. But if I love something about it, I love its lack of romanticism, its unromanticism. And I don't necessarily go around saying I love Los Angeles, but I think I do love the lack of romanticism that I sense in Los Angeles. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense about that era of Los Angeles. I mean, I find a lot of romanticism in sort of older Los Angeles, by which I mean Los Angeles of the 20s and 30s and 40s, and whatever the residue or the structures, whatever. I think about places like I'm particularly, I understand why, but I'm not thrilled about the reconstruction of the California Incline, because I love the California Incline as an artifact. Now, the California Incline, that structure was built in 1930. It's been pounded on by cars for 85 years. It's not seismically fit, right? So I completely understand why it needs to be replaced, but I mourn the loss of the original. There is something kind of romantic, for me at least, about that city. I think of it as a noir city, so that noir city. And it may just be because there's something romantic about the design. There's something I like about the Spanish Mission architecture. There's something I like about, there's just something I like about it, the deco touches. And it is very different. I mean, in that sense, that's something I've only seen, I've seen in California, but that was not part of my upbringing on the East. Those city built, a lot of structures built around the same time, but with a completely different aesthetic. So that aesthetic really says something to me about California, about Southern California, about a kind of quality of life. Those old duplexes, which I've lived in many of, with all the built-in stuff, the idea that even even in a utilitarian structure, even in a house where if you walk through some of those neighborhoods that were built in the 1920s, there are 5 or 6 model structures. So they were developed in a way, but, and they were definitely for sort of, they were utilitarian. They were middle-class housing, middle-class rental units. They have these touches. They have these little glosses. They're not necessary, even if they're just little, the place I live in now has a ziggurat design motif. And, when you go down, you come in the front door, you go down into the living room. It's a step down into the living room. The doorway has a kind of, reverse staircase ziggurat. They didn't have to do that. They did. So those little touches, they're little bits of elegance, I think. I find a lot of romance in that.
You write in Sidewalking that you started writing about Los Angeles, I believe, before you even lived here or attempted to. I mean, does anything of that era of your earliest Los Angeles writing survive in any form in this current book?
Probably not in the current book. The earliest writing, like all books, this book was both. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of new stuff, and then there's a lot of kind of revisiting or some things I pulled out of other things. Probably the earliest stuff in this book probably dates from around 04, maybe 05, which is when I started really writing about walking in Los Angeles. I'd been writing about Los Angeles. I sort of tried to write about it before I moved there, but I was writing from that New Yorker's perspective of how much could possibly be going on there and how hard could it be to wrap your mind around it, so I'll just do that. And then when I moved here in 1991, I started the first piece I actually wrote. The first Los Angeles piece I actually wrote was a piece that I wrote for the Los Angeles Reader, where I was working. I was a writer at the time, and it was called 500 Moves You In, and it was about looking for an apartment. I think I published that within the first month. It was a little personal essay about the different, and again, talk about a pattern. What I said was, the problem was too much choice. When I'd been looking for an apartment in Manhattan, it was like if you found one place that was remotely acceptable, you jumped.
Yes.
But there was this is also true of the early 1990s. When I was looking for an apartment in the early 1990s, there was so much in my price range with what I wanted that I was like, I don't want to rent this place because what if the next place is better? So it was a really sort of dislocating experience in that way. I think that's probably changed in some ways. It's been a long time since I've looked for an apartment, but I think that I didn't start, I walked the whole time, but I didn't really start thinking about what it meant to walk. Or what it meant to me to walk in Los Angeles until about 10, 11 years ago. And then I started writing about it. And so there's some stuff, or certainly some thoughts and some ideas and maybe a couple of passages here and there that kind of come from some of those early writings. That's probably the earliest stuff. And that, in some ways, although I didn't really start thinking about this book as a book or thinking that there was a book for a few years, probably until 08 or 09, that's the genesis of the book.
Right. The concept of walking in Los Angeles, I think some people will pick up your book purely for novelty reasons, I think, because it's not often written about. But that window is going to close sometime soon, where writing about walking in Los Angeles has novelty as a premise. I mean, how long do you think that books like yours have? It's viable right now to do that, but when will it not be? I'm going to write a book about walking in Manhattan. No, you're not. I mean, that's been done.
There was a really good book by an architect named Michael Sorkin, I think, called 20 Minutes in Manhattan, which is a book about walking in Manhattan, which came out a couple of years ago, which is fantastic. I mean, really
well,
smart.
in Los Angeles, too, I think, Michael Sorkin.
Did he write a book about Los Angeles,
written
too?
Articles, I think.
Maybe he has, yeah. I mean, I believe that's it's called 20 Minutes in Manhattan. But in any event, so I think partly it depends on can you bring a lens to it that no one else has.
Walking can be an element.
Walking can be an element. For me, it was a matter of I like looking for a kind of counterintuitive lens, both because I think primarily in some ways because it jars me out of my complacency. Right, if I'm going to write about this city from a point of view of a pedestrian, whether or not I am a pedestrian in the city, it makes me have to kind of rethink my own relationship or my own engagement or step out of the expected in a certain way. And I think for a writer, that's always a good thing. So that was one point. I also was very aware, have always been aware in terms of writing about Los Angeles, not just for myself, that it is a city that that is largely defined outside of itself by cliche and stereotype. And so what do we do to jar ourselves out of out of that landscape, out of the landscape of cliche. And so for me, one way is to take something that feels really unlikely or counterintuitive in a certain sense, because it kind of pushes the conversation into a different direction. It is a book there's a lot of walking in the book. It's not, it was originally intended to be a book about walking, but it became a book about walking and a bunch of other things. But that filter at least for me, allowed me to kind of keep it. And I think goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of my experience in Los Angeles. It allowed me to define my own experience and relationship to the city in terms of a very direct engagement with place.
If you could hand this book back to 1991 to yourself, just arriving in Los Angeles, how would he react to what you've written?
It's a really interesting question.
Would anything be shocking?
Well, I think he would be shocked, as I am, that I have spent 20 some years writing about Los Angeles, which is a place that when I got here I didn't really intend to stay for longer than a couple of years. So I think that would be the first thing. I don't know. I actually I don't often think about I was 29 then. I don't often think of my 29-year-old self. I have an ongoing dialogue with my 19-year-old self, but it doesn't have much to do with Los Angeles.
Fair enough. Somehow not the subject. So I just wonder if something would be surprising to you or anyone, in the city at that time, would it have to do with how the city itself has changed, or with the way that the city can now be written about, or something? I feel like it would be. It's not the book anybody would expect to have. Anybody then would expect to be written about Los Angeles in the future, exactly. Do you get what I mean? Or
I do. Although I think, again, I discovered all this stuff later, not when I first got there, but within the first 10 years. But, Mark Norman wrote that book, Bike Riding in Los Angeles, which came out in 1972. There's a wealth of stuff that has been written about the city over the last century that is very idiosyncratic and very personal. Richard Rayner's Los Angeles Without a Map, or LA Without a Map, which is one of my favorite. He calls it a novel, but I think of it as the main character's
barely a novel, by his admission.
The main character's name is Richard Rayner. So, but he doesn't drive, right? He doesn't drive in actual life, but the character doesn't drive. So that sense of a bus rider's Los Angeles, or a passenger's Los Angeles, or a kind of conditional Los Angeles, which was very much my experience when I got here, both because for a long time my wife and I shared a single car, and also because I had a very close friend who lived here, and I would always let him drive because he liked to drive, which I don't. And he also knew the city. He'd been living here for a number of years. He'd been living here for about 7 years when I got here. So he knew the city really well. And so in many ways, the first year or two that I was here, he was sort of, among other things, he was my tour guide. And so but that sense of being a passenger, that kind of lack of agency, which I remember really well, sitting in the passenger seat of his car on some freeway that I wasn't exactly sure which freeway we were on because I hadn't been paying that much attention, and seeing, not really knowing the city well enough and thinking every cluster of big buildings was downtown, but none of them actually were, and sort of having this kind of dislocated sense. But I didn't have to. He was driving, so I didn't have to worry about where we were.
You're watching a movie, essentially.
Exactly, I was watching a movie, and so there is something. I remember that quite vividly. So I think in that sense. That sense of first of dislocation, and then of trying to kind of negotiate a relationship with space. That was always part of the mix. The city has absolutely changed in many ways over that period of time. There's parts of it that haven't changed. I think, for me, one of the most fundamental changes, which I think is just inevitable any place if you live for long enough, is that I feel a real strong sense of community here, which partly has to do with the city and partly has to do with just the fact that I've lived here a long time and I've gotten to know a lot of people really well and have been part of a number of overlapping communities. That was something that I think my 1991 self did not believe was possible. So that might be the component that he would be most surprised by.
And finally, we're sitting here in the Miracle Mile neighborhood. which is the neighborhood that gave your book it's a working title, and it's the neighborhood you've been here the whole time. Yes, you've always lived in the Miracle Mile.
In and around. I mean, yes, basically in Pico, Robertson, Fairfax, Mid-City, Miracle Mile. Yeah.
So, do you ever fantasize about living anywhere else in Los Angeles, given all the neighborhoods that are here that we've discussed? There's many more than we've brought up. Is there any place that you think, maybe that would be a place to view Los Angeles from as well for me?
I have, and at the moment I don't. And the reason why is because at this point, again, thinking about sort of how we kind of create the landscape, I love Silver Lake. I love Echo Park. I like downtown. I actually could see myself moving downtown, although I don't know that I would, but I could see myself living down there. This neighborhood for me is a kind of perfect mix of things. It's pedestrian friendly. It's residential, but it's also commercial. It's identifiably urban in a way that feels comfortable to me. People on the streets, big buildings. It's very neighborhood centric in a sense. I mean, there's a real feeling of neighborhood. The neighborhood that I live in, has a neighborhood association, a neighborhood newsletter, and, like a street fair and stuff. I mean, little things, but I like that. Again, other ways of kind of interacting with place. I feel like I belong in this neighborhood, and, that too is something that I think kind of crept up on me and caught me by surprise. I felt that way for quite some time now, but I think when I first became conscious of it, it was also with a consciousness that I had never expected necessarily to feel that kind of connection to place in this city. So I never rule anything out. It's always, anything's a possibility. But for right now, and especially with sort of the things that are happening here, the expansion of the museum, the public art. There's something.
8 years you're getting a subway station.
8 years I'm getting a subway station. It's like no time. I've only been waiting for a quarter of a century. So what's 8 more?
You can do a few exactly. more. You'll be there on day one, I imagine.
I will be there. I rode the Red Line day one. I was at Union Station day one, January 30th, 1993, to ride that train back and forth a bit.
It's going to be a great day whenever they get it open.
It will be a great day. The only reason, and I do not want them, but the only benefit to us getting the Olympics is maybe they'll get additional federal transportation funding and be able to open them a little more quickly. But
here's hoping.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a worthwhile trade-off.
I've been speaking here in the Miracle Mile with David L. Ulin. He's a book critic at the Los Angeles Times, author of Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles most recently, but other books as well, like The Myth of Solid Ground, The Lost Art of Reading, and not a book on the Clash's London Calling. That is not a book he's written. Don't order that one. Do order Sidewalking.
But read the review on Goodreads.
Yeah, read just the Goodreads review and wonder how that came into being and who wrote it. He's also the editor of anthologies you can't afford to miss if you're into the writing of Los Angeles over the years. Those would be Reading Los Angeles and Another City. David, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. Keep up with me at colinmarshall.org and with the LARB at lareviewofbooks.org. Thanks.